I'm really pleased to introduce Betty Folliard, who is coming today to talk about the efforts to enshrine the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, into the Minnesota Constitution. Betty was co-founder of ERA Minnesota, and she has worked tirelessly for years, and she can give us that history far better than me. But she's very much worked hand in hand with the Minnesota legislature, worked personally with many, many representatives, was a representative herself for several years. Thank you for your service in that way, Betty. And has really been a powerhouse behind getting the ERA to the point it is at in Minnesota, where we are on the eve of it passing. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Betty to share a little more, and I'm going to put you on spotlight. Betty.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Renee. Lovely to be working with you. Hello, everybody. Hello, Minnesota Now. The last time I spoke to Minnesota Now was at the national conference in Minneapolis or Bloomington, whatever it was. And I think it was 2018 with Ellie Smeal, who I've had the honor of working with now for 10 years on the federal ERA. And of course, she goes back to being one of the top leaders of the federal ERA all the way back to the 70s. So that's a great honor. And just by the way, I was on the Minnesota Now board many, many years ago for a brief time. So I have a long history with you all. And I want to say from ERA Minnesota, our deepest thanks to Minnesota Now for all you do, to Lynn for the contributions that come from the foundation, to the folks who show up at the Capitol, to Mary Bren, who is a rock star doing our fiscal work as our fiscal sponsor. So again, thank you, thank you, thank you. Now, moving right along, Renee is going to pull up my PowerPoint presentation. And what we're going to do today, because I want to connect some dots from the beginning of this movement to the evolution of equal rights in Minnesota in this country. And you cannot talk about the state ERA without giving the foundation of the federal. And because we are fighting for both, we have not finished the federal ERA, even though it's ratified with 38 states. We continue to fight with both, and we continue to work with the ERA caucus at the federal level, with the new Young Feminist Party, with all the good people at the federal level all across the state to get the ERA over the finish line at the federal level. So have you got that up, Renee?
Yeah, just give me 1 second. My apologies. I forgot to put it on my screen. So
okay, well,
right
let me
there.
just kind of warm it up a little bit then.
Yes. You go ahead and start talking, and I will pop it onto the screen, and you can tell me where to move to. Sorry about that.
And we're going to go very rapidly through the slides, but it's just a really fun romp through history to see the thread that goes all the way through the beginning of this country to now, and that we've never stopped fighting. You know, I talk about the Equal Rights Amendment. I said something on Twitter this morning about how we've waited on our and so whoever is talking needs to mute themselves now, or if
she's been on the same ones.
If Renee can mute everybody there.
Betty, you need to unmute. Sorry, I muted all.
Unmute. Okay, we're ready. Okay, starting with the first slide. Here we are, ERA Minnesota. And if you can take out the side one, that would be good, unless that's just, I only see it. Give them the full screen there. We're advocating for adding an equal rights amendment into both our state and federal constitutions. Next slide. Okay, so what we're seeing here is who we are. ERA Minnesota started in 2014. I founded it. I raised the money for 50 people to go to Washington, D.C. We went over there for a women's rights march and rally, which we hadn't seen for decades. And suddenly we discovered all these pockets of organizations all across the country who were working on the Equal Rights Amendment. In 2012, you know, the organization Equal Means Equal, they started in 2012. In 2014, that same year that we from Minnesota, with all the energy from the Women's Economic Security Act, went to Washington, D.C., we formed ERA Minnesota that year. And what do? We educate, organize, and activate for equality for all. We build coalitions and recruit and activate activists to get the ERA passed. We survey and identify ERA certified candidates in November elections, and we work with legislators all the time, every day right now, to advance the state ERA. And of course, we work on the federal ERA as well. And there's in the lower right-hand corner are two of our chief authors. On the left is Representative Kristen Bonner, and on the right is Representative Kali Herr. Next slide, please. So we're going to talk about real quickly what it is, a brief history of the federal ERA, why do we need the ERA, arguments against the ERA, and why now. And then really the substance of this talk is going to be deep and wide and up to the minute, the Minnesota ERA ballot initiative. Next slide, please. So here we are, equal rights under the law. There's a snapshot of the Supreme Court in Washington, D.C., with Lady Justice up at the top, equal justice under the law, except for women, except for many, many marginalized and minoritized groups over the history of this country. Next slide, please. So turn it to the next slide, what it is. Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. That is the federal ERA. It's the second version of it that came out in like 1940s. Next slide, please. So a brief history of the federal ERA. Next slide. Fem covert. The English common law came over from across the pond when the colonies were being created, and it specifically said that a married woman was a femme covert. She was covered by her husband in all rights. She didn't have any rights. She could not own property or make contracts, etc., and she was covered by her husband's rights. And single women and girls were dependent for their civil rights on male relatives. By the way, there are still about 12 what we call classical patriarchies in the world now. And there are even pockets of classical patriarchies dotted around this country in many states, including Minnesota. Next slide, please. So in 1787, now we're going to be skipping about 50 years at a time or a little more at times, the U.S. Constitution was exclusive. It excluded women, it excluded marginalized and minoritized groups. Our founders decided they were going to write this, and of course you all know the story of Abigail Adams. As John Adams was riding off to you can stay there, that's fine, to create the Constitution. And she said, remember the ladies? And they forgot. So now we leap forward another many years to 1848. And just knowing that from the beginning, women knew that they were left out when the rights were passed out. It wasn't something that just came to them. But by 1848, women had had enough, and that's when Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton got together and said, we're going to do the first women's rights convention in Seneca Falls, New York. And they from the time they thought about that to the time they did it was 9 days. And you think about that, going by horse and buggy to tell people we're doing a women's rights convention, and within 9 days, 400 people converged on Seneca Falls, New York, and they held this convention, which was the very first one. Next slide, please. Go back. You went one too many there. Go back. Go back. There. Okay, so women declare that all men and women are equal. That's in the Declaration of Sentiments that was written by Elizabeth Cady Stanton for the Women's Rights Convention. They named pages of ways that women were being discriminated against. And as you know, the suffragists came out of the abolitionist movement. And so there were many people, including, as we'll see, Frederick Douglass, who were at this event. And not all of them signed on because some of this seemed pretty radical, but there were 68 women and 32 men who signed on to the Seneca Falls Convention, Women's Rights Convention. Next slide, please. So here's Frederick Douglass and Susan B. Anthony. You all know these folks, but did you know that following the Civil War, when the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments were ratified, that it was the first time that the word male was entered into the U.S. Constitution? And so just so you know, there is a wonderful statue out in front of Susan B. Anthony's house, because these two people were dear friends. And every time that Frederick Douglass came to speak in Rochester, New York, where Susan B. Anthony lived, he stayed at her house. He stayed at her house many times. And they were friends throughout their life, except that when the 15th Amendment came along, there was this wrenching tear that happened because the abolitionists and suffragists were working together so hard. And of course, it was an all-male Congress at the time, and they could not get both African-American men and women into the Constitution in the 15th Amendment. And so that was a point where Frederick Douglass declared, well, this is the Negro hour. It is not the women's hour. And there's a famous book called The Women's Hour by Elaine Weiss that I recommend to you to read about all that happened. And then, you know, one of the things I always talk about when I talk about our founding mothers in this country, the people who we hold up in high esteem, that they were imperfect people just like us. And they made their mistakes one at a time, just like us. And some terrible things were said when women were left behind the door when the rights were passed out with the 15th Amendment. Racist comments, and you all have read about them, and it was not pretty. But we can bow to history and not be bound by it. And that's something that I said to Representative Lee Finke, the first transgender woman representative last year, when she was saying, well, you know, Betty, feminists left the women left lesbians behind in the last movement. And I said, we can bow to history and not be bound by it. We can always learn from this cloud of witnesses who have handed down their knowledge to us and their wisdom to us, and see their mistakes and not make the same mistakes over again. Next slide, please. So that began the long march in the 1860s after the Civil War, and women didn't get the right to vote, and Susan B. Anthony got arrested for voting and got fined with a fine that she never paid. That began the long march, and here's a wonderful picture from New York in 1913. Next slide, please. And finally, we get the vote, right, in 1920 for some women, for most women. That was my grandma got to vote. And many of you probably heard those stories in your own families. Next slide, please. And here we have Susan B. Anthony, and there's Crystal Eastman, the two people who sat down after they got the vote and said, but wait, that's not enough. We still don't have rights. I mean, we can vote. That's all we can do, and it's not for everybody. And so they sat down and they wrote the first version, the Lucretia Mott version of the Equal Rights Amendment. Next slide, please. So more marching. So in 1923, it was introduced in the First Presbyterian Church in Seneca Falls, New York, the first language of the Equal Rights Amendment. And then it was introduced in Congress by Daniel Reed Anthony Jr., Susan B. Anthony's nephew, who was a congressman. And once again, we had to march and march and march and march. Continue on. And more marching until 1972. And there we are in the March for Equality in the 1970s. That banner still gets pulled out. There's a picture the Young Feminist Party has of them on Constitution Avenue with that banner. So we got it, and it was sent out to the states overwhelmingly by Congress that the Equal Rights Amendment was passed through both houses. Next slide, please. And of course, as you know, it had that arbitrary time limit. I call it the arbitrary capricious time limit that was imposed on the Equal Rights Amendment by a Southern, I think he was a Democrat, I'm not sure, who was basically just trying to kill the ERA. And so that was the compromise. And so the federal ERA then gets through 35 states, and then it stopped, almost stopped. But Congress says, oh, no, we'll extend it 3 more years. We'll give women's rights 10 years to pass. And this is a wonderful picture of Jimmy Carter with, you can see Rosalind Carter on the right there, signing the extension on the ERA. And this was ironic because, as you know, presidents don't have a role in signing resolutions. He didn't need to sign it. But the closer that people get to passing an ERA, the more people want to touch it. And that happened this past year, when we passed our resolution to Congress to enact the 28th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, the Equal Rights Amendment, and it was successfully passed overwhelmingly in the House and Senate last year and sent to Congress. And as soon as it passed, Governor Walz signed it. And he had no need to sign it. It's a resolution, and there's no line there to have him sign it. But the closer that we get, the more people want to touch the ERA. Next slide, please. So you know the Stop the ERA. Next slide, please. And so we faced that deadline, and the ERA went dormant for about 3 decades until 1996 or 7, when a Congressional Research Service report came out saying that, oh, by the way, the time limit is unconstitutional and rescissions are unconstitutional. I like to remind everybody that it's bipartisan. It's really, the ERA is nonpartisan. It is nonpartisan. It is for everybody. It was first introduced by a Republican, and it was supported by every Republican president and first lady up until Reagan. It was added to the Republican platform first in 1940, and then in 1944, it was introduced in the Democratic platform. It came off of both of them at different times. In 1980, it came off from the Republican platform. And then in 2005, it came off the Democratic platform, and we got it back on in 2011. Next slide, please. Now, here's that lovely picture in front of the First Presbyterian Church in Seneca Falls, New York. And it was taken on the day that the Equal Rights Amendment was passed in 1923. Next slide. And here we are 100 years later in 2023, And if you squint your eyes, up there in the middle in the back is Suzanne Wilhite. Hi, Suzanne. I'm so glad you're here. And over to the right in white with a sash, you'll see me up front with Ting Ting Chen next to me, who is the head of the ERA Law Project at Columbia University Law School. And in the middle, behind that yellow sign, you will see the governor of New York and the Attorney General Letitia James of New York. It was a big deal. And if you could really see those faces, you would see that 60% of that crowd at the 100th Centennial Convention where I spoke, 60% is young people. Very diverse, it's now you talk about the evolution of the ERA. This is the ERA today and the leadership across the country. Next slide, please. So here is our leadership now. You see it's very diverse. Starting in the upper left-hand corner is Zakiya Thomas, the head of ERA Coalition. Next to her, Senator Gillibrand. Next to her, our friend Kamala Lopez, who's the founder of Equal Means Equal in LA. Next to her is rock star Congressman Ayanna Presley. Below left is Senator Ben Cardin, who has been carrying the Equal Rights Amendment for years. Next to him is another favorite person who was in New York with us, Congressman Cori Bush. And next to her is Senator Lisa Murkowski. And oh, by the way, that is bipartisan. Next slide, please. So why do we still need it? Next slide. Well, you all know gender gap, sex harassment, sex discrimination in the workforce, sexual violence, unequal access to health care, COVID pandemic set us back, and overturning Roe v. Wade in 2022 in the Dobbs-Jackson versus Jackson Supreme Court case. It was the first time that we experienced a rescission of rights since the 1800s. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to go through all of it, but you know that in Minnesota, women make 81 cents on the dollar, 2/3 of minimum wage earners are women, and tipped workers, women. The rate of seniors who live in poverty, 2/3 is higher in women than in men, and unequal pay and workforce sexual harassment are strongly linked. Next slide. We're going to go through this, keep going. Next slide. I want to say here, I'm going to stop here because sexual violence is a huge part of it. You know, nationwide, 81% of women and 43% of men reported experiencing some form of sexual harassment or assault in their life. 1 in 4 women will be raped or sexually assaulted in their lifetime. That's in the United States of America. And less than 1% of rapes will ever get felony convictions. Next slide. So it's equal access to health care. You know, talk about Black women 2 to 3 times more likely to die in pregnancy-related complications than white women. And American Indian and Alaskan Native women are 2 times more likely to die of pregnancy-related causes than white women. Next slide. So arguments against, we're going to go through this fast. I'm just going to list them off real fast, okay? Next slide. 14th Amendment, equal protection includes protection against sex, except it doesn't. I was just watching a really good little clip from Ruth Bader Ginsburg about that. Next slide. Here she is. She says, if I could choose an amendment to add to the Constitution, it would be the Equal Rights Amendment. I'd like to see my daughters, when they pick up the Constitution, to see that notion that women and men are persons of equal stature. I'd like them to see that is a basic principle in our society. And Justice Antonin Scalia, that famous quote, when they say there's no provision against sex discrimination, here it is. He says, certainly the Constitution does not require discrimination on the basis of sex. The only issue is whether it prohibits it. It doesn't. Next slide. So argument 2, we have plenty of protective laws. Oh, they always say that. It's not true. Laws are only as strong as the constitutional language behind them, and they can be unenforced, changed, or repealed. And an equal rights amendment will give the highest level of scrutiny that the Constitution provides. Next slide. So argument 3, the ERA could expand abortion rights. Well, it never has. There are 27 states today, and there's going to soon be 28 in New York, that have state constitutions, and they have never expanded abortion access. They have protected the laws that are existing on the books in those states to full health care. New Mexico, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, and Utah, it's protecting right now because there's an old law that the antis want to bring back, and they're saying, no, we have an equal rights amendment. So there are other states too. Next slide. So you know the argument about putting women in the military and in combat. Well, we're already in combat. We just get less pay for it. Next slide. So here's the nice overview of the federal ERA and all the states that ratified, all in pink, ratified before 1982, that time limit. And then the 3 yellows are the states that have ratified in the last 7 years. Next slide. So why do we still need it? Next slide. This is so important. We're the only developed nation out of 187 members of the United Nations with a constitution that does not explicitly protect rights for women. And we're one of only 7 countries in the world who still have not ratified the international treaty that is the Women's Rights Treaty that defines discrimination on the basis of sex, the Commission for the Eradication of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW. Next slide. So really quickly, there is still an action step that everybody needs to take. You can sign on to Sign for ERA to get on the petition that they now have nearly 100,000 signatures to take to the White House. You can call the White House and say to Biden, tell the archivist to publish the ERA, and keep the pressure on our federal elected officials on this. Just keep bringing it up. The nice thing is that Senator Amy Klobuchar talks about it, and she's talked about it this year. Next slide. She talked about it in her presidential race as well. So now here we are to the crux of the matter. Next slide. This is a snapshot of all the states that have state ERAs. In the dark blue are the states that have them. The yellow are states that have gender equality provisions. They may not be as strong, but they're there. And the light blue are the states currently that are working on achieving a state ERA. And of course, there's Minnesota. Next slide. And I mentioned to you that we've had these 2 bills now going for since 2015, when we first started advocating at the state capitol for the state ERA. And we've been there every year, first day of session, the International Women's Day, and all the way through. But last year, we passed our Minnesota resolution to Congress to affirm the ERA as the 28th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. And it was huge. It took 9 years to get that. It was a huge win. And one of the things that I am most proud of is that initiative of writing a resolution to Congress to tell them to finish passing the ERA, Minnesota wrote the first one. And we were the ones who kept on bringing this to our federal groups, ERA Coalition and Equal Means Equal, and saying, you should do this too. And gradually, other states started entering our language. And then it changed, the language changed once in 2022, the 28th Amendment should have been enacted. And so we said, we added the language, the 28th Amendment to it, passed it, and 5 other states passed it last year too. So this is a big win for all of us. But as you know, the state ERA ballot initiative is still flapping in the wind here. So let's talk about that. Next slide, please. And of course, you all know that we passed it through the Senate 43-23, which was overwhelmingly bipartisan, because when you think about it, the Senate only has a 1-vote majority of Democrats. And so that was a lot of Republicans who were on there with us. So here's the language. All persons shall be guaranteed equal rights under the laws of this state. The state shall not discriminate against any person in intent or effect on account of race, color, national origin, ancestry, disability, or sex, including but not limited to pregnancy outcomes, and reproductive freedom, gender identity and gender expression, or sexual orientation. Now, some of you go, whoa, that's really expansive language. Well, so what happened was we took the Nevada language last year, which said equality of rights shall not be denied by the state or cities or counties or other subdivisions on account of race, color, creed, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, age, disability, or ancestry, country of origin. And that was what passed through the Senate. So you hear in there that it had expansive language that included race, national origin, ancestry, disability, or sex, but it didn't have the explicit sex reproductive rights piece in it. So why is it in there today? The reason is because on the last day of session, when the Senate File 37 was on the House floor for final passage, it was pulled off the floor, and we were told that the speaker and the majority leader wanted to have the reproductive rights language put together. This is something that ERA Minnesota offered them back in January of 2023. That was when New York became the first state in the nation to adopt what I call ERA plus repro version of the Equal Rights Amendment. And it all had to do with the Dobbs decision. Once they took away our rights to reproductive freedom in this country, it became necessary, because when the Supreme Court did that, they pushed the decisions down to the states. And now states have to act. They have to act to ensure that future legislatures don't change the rights. In Minnesota last year, we passed the PRO Act, we passed the Trans Refuge Bill. All of the pieces of the expanded language in the whole bill of this version, all of it is already in law. We're not reinventing the wheel here. We're just saying we want it put in the Constitution, because laws are fickle. They come and go with the prevailing political winds, and we don't want our rights to blow away again. Next slide, please. So here it is, just broken down. It's multi-generational, it's inclusive, and it's intersectional. When I talked at the beginning about the evolution of the Equal Rights Amendment, we have evolved. This is who we are today. This is who we want to make sure is protected for the next 7 generations. We're not kidding. All means all. We're not having any carve-outs here. We're not having any, when we talk about equality, we say equality has no qualifiers. It's everybody. Next slide, please. And why do we need it? To embed Minnesota values into this Constitution. Because discrimination is not a Minnesota value. To make clear that in Minnesota, freedom and equality of rights are non-negotiable. To protect rights currently in laws from being rescinded by future legislatures and courts, and to catch up with the 27, almost 28 other states that currently have state ERAs. Minnesota is not exceptional. I know a lot of you have been working on this for a long time, but now we're encapsulating it and saying everyone should have the same right to the same rights, that we want our freedoms, and that bodily autonomy is absolutely essential to equality. Next slide. Just so you know that all of this is in the Human Rights Act. We have one of the most expansive ones in the country. And the Minnesota State Constitution, it's strong, but we want to make our rights permanent now in it. Now, just keep in mind that the Constitution was written in 1857. 1857 was the year of the Dobbs decision. The Dobbs decision that said that enslaved men, enslaved people could not have citizenship. And you think of 1857, that's before the Civil War, and women didn't have rights, marginalized communities didn't have rights, very few people had rights. The minority had rights of white landowning men. Next slide, please. So why do we still need it? Well, because racism, anti-LGBTQI plus hate, sexism, and misogyny are still the norm. Because in Minnesota, women make on average 81 cents to a man's dollar, with much, much larger inequities for Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Asian women, and women of color. Because 2/3 of U.S. seniors who live in poverty are women, because 2/3 of minimum wage earners are women, and 2/3 of tip workers are women, because 1 in 5 women will be raped during their lifetime, and less than 1% of rapes lead to felony convictions, because we're still fighting the battle for voting rights for all, because less than 2% of philanthropy dollars go to women and children's initiatives, because women still get fired for being pregnant, because childcare can cost more than college, because some bosses deny workers birth control coverage, because we are one of only 5 industrialized countries in the world that have no paid maternity leave, because women can fight and die for their country, they still don't have equal rights, and because we're not willing to wait another 247 years for equality. That's why. Next slide. In the legislature right now, we've got the House saying that they have to have a universal agreement in order to bring the new language into as an amendment onto SF 37 and pass it through rules and put it on the House floor to pass and go to the Senate. And once it does that, it's just a simple concurrence vote in the Senate because they already passed the original one. But what we've got right now is, as I say, the Speaker of the House saying we have to have a universal agreement. That's a behind the scenes agreement. That is basically trying to skip over what we've done for generations and generations, and that is having a conference committee to work out the details. They want the Senate to either agree with the language or come up with their changes to the language. The Senate's having a harder time because the Senate already passed the bill, and they only have a 1-vote majority. And so they've got a couple of senators in there with nervous knees, and it's a problem because they just, the answer that's come back once again, even this week, was, we already passed it. Now you pass it. So that puts the onus back on the House to do the heavy lifting, and the House doesn't want to do that. They want to have this universal agreement. So it's a little bit of a, cat and mouse thing going on right now. And I know that they're working hard on it. The Senate actually has caucused it 3 times. The third time was for a very short period of time, but they've caucused it a lot. They've talked about it. And so what's happening now is, on the outside, over the last many months since the last session, during last session, first of all, ERA Minnesota was working with United Strategies to put together a whole plan to have a successful ballot initiative. That came out with a big report that we did, and then we worked with Gender Justice and Planned Parenthood all summer and fall. I chaired those meetings for months. We came up with, at our first meeting, exactly what we were going to do. We were going to, number one, put together an attorneys roundtable to come up with a new language. That was 14 attorneys, 2 national and 12 local. And then, thank you, Renee. And then put together a poll. We did our poll. It came back 68% to 26% in favor of the new language. We then did put together what was called the Ballot Initiative Committee, and Gender Justice has now taken a lead on this. They came in all ready to do this, and they're fully engaged, and they're going to take a lead as the organization to carry us into the Ballot Initiative Committee. But we're still in this cat and mouse back and forth. Next slide, please. And I'll wrap up. So here we are. There's our 2 chief authors of SF-37. On the left is Kali Her. On the right is Mary Kunish. Next slide. Next slide. And finally, so what can you do? You know what you can do. You can keep on helping us get the word to the legislature that the time is now for the ERA. And help us in any way you can. Go get our e-news from ERA Minnesota, eramn.org, and join us at the Capitol whenever you can. And we're going to be there kind of regularly now until they get it. And then we'll let you know when it's going to be on the House floor and on the Senate floor. We believe it's going to get done this year. We've been given promises on both sides that they want it done. And we're on the right side of history. We won't take no for an answer, and we will prevail. That's it. Thank you. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you so much, Betty. I really appreciate you sharing all that wonderful information. Sorry for the slight technical difficulties I'm having with so many things in the background that I'm trying to monitor at the same time. It's been a little complicated, more complicated than I realized it would be. But I really appreciate all your hard work on this. I know that folks have questions for Betty, but we have our next speaker already here. And so we're going to not take questions. However, Betty, how can people reach out to you if they want to follow up on something?
Sure. Well, you can go to info@eramn.org. And I ask you also to go on social media at Betty. On Twitter, I'm at bfolly, just bfolly, BFOLLY, all lowercase. And also go to ERA Minnesota's Facebook page and at ERA Minnesota, or just ERAMN, and it'll get you there. But you can also, I'll put my personal email in the chat here, and you can anytime reach out to me with questions, or, you want to get connected in, I'm always available. So please feel free to join me. Again, I just want to say thank you to ERA, to Minnesota Now, for all you do for ERA Minnesota and for being such champions. Let's get it done. Thanks.
Thank you, Betty.